The first people to live in the area that we now call Copenhagen, New York, were the Oneida Indians. They came here during summers to hunt and fish. The Oneida tribe called the area Ash Swamp because there were so many black ash trees near the river. Nathan Munger Jr., along with his father, three brothers, Calvin Blodgett, and Nathan's oldest sister Betsy, who would cook, all came together from Utica to this area in 1800. He located his farm on both sides of the Deer River to secure the mill privileges of High Falls. They cleared off the corner where the Sylvester house would stand, down to the bend in the river. They built a sawmill, a grist mill, and a log home with nails, saw, and ironwork they brought with them from Utica. They sawed the first board and ground the first grist in the town of Denmark. The settlement became known as Munger's Mills. In the spring of 1801, Nathan married Amelia Barker. They took a wedding trip in a lumber wagon covered with canvas to protect them and their few effects from the sun and storm. They settled in their log house, located between the Sylvester house and the river. The road to the mill ran between the house and the river. Amelia, although she was homesick, along with her husband, prospered and raised a family of 6 children. Nathan was killed on August 31st, 1811. The name of the village was changed to Copenhagen in 1807. Wars in Europe caused England to attack the city of Copenhagen, Denmark. The British wanted Denmark to join the British side. People here felt sorry for the citizens of Copenhagen, Denmark. They also wanted to make fun of other settlers who sided with the British. At a town meeting, they voted and changed the town's name to Copenhagen. It remains the only place in the United States to be called Copenhagen. Before Copenhagen had a bridge across the Deer River, the early pioneers used to drive their oxen and carts through the river. In about 1802, there was a log bridge across the river and 4 or 5 log houses here. A wooden bridge spanning the Deer River was replaced with a steel structure in 1888. While the old bridge was being torn down, a road was opened at the rear of Mr. Stanton and Mr. McCune's stores. The river had to be forded, and re-entry upon Main Street was by the Corcoran Brothers block. That bridge was washed away in the spring of 1915. It is recalled by Mrs. Flora Wicks, a teacher in the district school on the Deer River Road. Mr. Wicks, then courting his future wife, used to take her to school. On that particular day, they had crossed the bridge and were on Cataract Street when they heard a loud crash and looked back to see the bridge gone. A concrete bridge was built shortly thereafter. That bridge underwent extensive repairs in 1973. This is when the surface had a dome shape. Construction to widen Route 12 and replace the bridge began in May 2006 and was completed in the late summer of 2007. The new bridge was adjacent to the old bridge, and when it was completed, the old bridge was taken down on June 28, 2007. Factory Street runs along the north side of the Cottage Inn and along the river. It is believed that this is where Nathan Munger Jr. built his sawmill and gristmill in 1801. In the early years, this became the industrial area of Copenhagen. Along with the mills, several homes were built on the street. Businessmen built a dam across the Deer River as early as 1815 to supply water power to run the machinery in the mills. The Austin Block was on the corner of Factory Street and Route 12 on the riverbank. It extended from the bridge to the Twining Mill. It contained several apartments. It was later owned by Mr. Harrison Boynton. Moses Lang owned a harness shop in the rear of the Boynton Block until the 1930s. Laverne Moore operated a garage here, which was liquidated by auction in 1952. John S. Twining ran a sawmill and cheesebox factory just below the bridge until Mr. Twining's passing in 1912. The business was purchased by his son-in-law, Eugene B. Millard, and Edwin Rice. They enlarged the building and installed a rotary lathe for cutting veneer and cheese boxes. Later, they also cut commercial veneers. which were trucked to Rome and there made into plywood for furniture, trunks, typewriter cases, and other items. Eugene C. Hurd owned a grist mill along the riverbank just down from the Twining Mill. The mill was destroyed by fire and rebuilt in 1897. Howard Lamphere purchased the mill in 1899. Mr. Lamphere, assisted by A.J. Nellis, operated the mill until 1919, when Bernard Buhall purchased the mill. Mr. Buhall and Millard and Rice built a new dam on Deer River between the bridge and the Millard and Rice site to furnish water power for both mills. Mr. Buhall ran the mill until 1943. It remained closed until Bernard Buhall passed, February 23, 1972. Then Irvin Buhall dismantled the machinery and moved it out to save it. The building was torn down. Mr. Frank Labarge now owns the property and has erected a soft ice cream stand on the site, calling it the Old Mill. Just down the river from Buhall's grist mill was the woodworking shop of James and Edward Carey. They made sashes, blinds, butter tubs, and any other items needed in the vicinity. This plant was destroyed by fire and then relocated onto Cataract Street, where Frank Arnold's shop was later located. Ward's Mill was one of the leading industries of this village, employing about a dozen men in the manufacture of lumber and cheese boxes. During its history, it suffered several catastrophic events. One day in 1886, a heavy rain fell and raised Deer River above the usual mark. The pressure of the water was so great that some of the foundation of the mill gave way and water forced its way into the mill below, tearing out pulleys and machinery. Alvin J. Ward purchased Miss Anna Whiting's interest in the old Horace Ward Mill in 1890. In 1894, the mill was damaged by fire and rebuilt. Ward's Mill was again badly damaged by ice passing out of the Deer River in 1911. Huge cakes of ice lodged against the upper end of the mill, which was smashed in, and the boiler room filled with ice water. Considerable lumber was carried downstream, and wagons and sleighs in the lumber yard were buried in ice and water. Horses in the barn stood in 18 inches of water. A.J. Ward's mill was totally destroyed by fire in 1918. In 1808, Nathan Munger built the inn he called Sylvester House. It was the first two-story building in the area located on the site of the present-day Cottage Inn. In 1882, Nathan Munger's inn was owned by Mr. Loren Topman. The inn was called the Jackman House. During Topman's ownership, the inn was partially destroyed by fire and rebuilt. Fire struck the inn again in 1893, totally destroying it. In 1900, James D. Brooks made preparations to erect a first-class hotel on the Topman lot on the Brooklyn side of town. He had recently purchased the lot from J.S. Twining. He called his hotel the Cottage Inn. Stiles Curtis was the proprietor upon opening. In 1907, Herbert Chidester purchased the hotel and his daughter operated it until 1909. Clem Monnet owned the hotel in 1915. After Mr. Monnet's death, his widow married Mr. John Ryan, who operated the inn until 1918. During Prohibition, federal agents raided the property on 2 occasions and found up to 15 barrels of beer. In 1941, the Cottage Inn and its contents, owned at that time by Andrew Black, were put up for public auction. Alexander Kubacki purchased the inn, and Charles Woodward bought the inn, which had been closed for a period of time. In 1959, Mr. and Mrs. Leroy Byer purchased the inn. After Mr. Byer's death, his widow was married to Richard Vancore. Ma Alice, as she was known, operated the inn for 20 years. She and her Cottage Inn gang sponsored several events that raised $20,000 for the Multiple Sclerosis Society, as well as money to build a permanent building to house the village's bandwagon. She sold the inn to Mr. and Mrs. Howard Ramsey in 1973. In 1995, Miss Lisa Green was proprietor of the Cottage Inn. Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Powis are the present owners of the Cottage Inn. Remodeling and repairs have been done. Most notably is the new coat of gray paint on the exterior. The May 1877 Journal and Republican reports, the enterprising people of this village are fitting up the triangular piece of ground in front of the post office, near and north of the bridge, for a park. They are to enclose it with a neat and tasty fence. Shade trees are being put out, and a bandstand is to be erected within the enclosure for the purpose of beautifying the village. At the same time, it will accommodate the Raymond Band, one of the best bands ever organized in northern New York. On June 30, 1893, the village board designated land in the center of the village as a park, a site for a soldier's monument and bandstand, and appropriated $500 for that purpose. The work of removing fence, sidewalk, etc., and grading and preparing the foundation for the soldier's monument began. The entire park was filled to a depth of about 2 feet, as it was considerably lower than the street. The soldier's monument, made of white bronze, was erected under the direction of Mr. F. P. Lansing, the Bronze Company's agent at this place. The statue represents a Union soldier facing the south, with the American flag in his left hand and drawn sword in his right, in the attitude of defense. On the south side of the base is this inscription: "In honor of the boys in blue," erected in 1893 by appropriations from the town and subscriptions from many citizens, and dedicated to the veterans of the War of 1861, as from the town of Denmark and vicinity. The south panel and face of the second base contain the names of 57 veterans. On the west side is the roster of the F. M. Leonard Post, number 525, Grand Army of the Revolution, in which are the names of 72 veterans. On the north side are the names of 70 veterans. The plinth has in large raised letters the words Gettysburg and Chancellorsville. On the east side of the plinth are the words Antietam and Second Bull Run. The base contains the names of 40 veterans. On the panel of the die is this inscription: "They need no monument who fought and died for their country, but their country ever needs the memory and inspiration of their example. It is an elegant design and an honor to any town or village." In 1902, improvements were made to the appearance of the park. It was newly graded and sodded, and the bandstand repaired. The old cannon, heavy siege gun, which is in the park, was very improperly mounted upon wheels as though it were a field piece. It was later placed in position as it should have been. In 2002, workers from Johnson Lumber Company, Deer River, constructed a new bandstand on the park triangle. In 2003, electrical students from Howard G. Sackett Technical Center wired this bandstand for sound. Ashley Davenport built a hardware business in 1870. It was a double block containing 2 stores located next to the bridge on the right-hand side as you travel south. When R.G. McEwen came to Copenhagen in 1875, he purchased the Davenport block, which at that time included Hadcock's Hardware and F.W. Pierce's plumbing and tinware business. Mr. McEwen operated the building nearest the river. His store stocked builders and shelf hardware, agricultural implements, pumps, piping, stoves, furnaces, tinware, silverware, and showcase goods. Upon his death, Mrs. Robert Ross continued the business. In 1921, she sold the shop to Harmon Kelsey and his son Howard. Howard purchased the business from his father in 1930 and ran it until his death in 1960. Louis Alexander remembers Mr. Kelsey to be an accomplished tinsmith. He remembers there being a hole in the floor of Mr. Kelsey's workshop where all the tin snips would drop into the river. Maxine Pridell says Mr. Kelsey could make anything. She recalls the stove he had made. It was a round barrel, and the used oil dripped down into it and burned to provide heat in his store. The store on the left was a general store operated by Lucian Clark and then by Oscar Hadcock. Mr. Hadcock kept a stock of groceries and a good assortment of goods in general. He sold his stock of groceries to Fred Angle, who continued the business. Subsequent owners included Benjamin Stanton, whose son-in-law, M.L. Hungerford, took over upon his death. After Mr. Hungerford's death, his son-in-law, Alfred Chickering, operated the business until 1941. He rented the building to the Victory stores for a year and then sold it to the Townsend Club. This business block was later burned down by the Copenhagen Fire Department. There were several blacksmiths located in Copenhagen in the early years, meeting the needs of people in this area. Arthur Frink, a blacksmith on the Brooklyn side of the river, was located in one of the oldest buildings in Copenhagen. It was originally built as a two-family house by Timothy Twitchell in about 1801. The property was sold to Eleazar Sylvester, who operated a store between the house and the store formerly owned by A.A. Chickering. Andrew Prue rented the property and operated a blacksmith shop there. Nathaniel Sylvester inherited the property and operated the store and a hotel across the road where the Cottage Inn stands today. Ashley Davenport and Hugh Bigman became owners of the property. Mr. Frink was an apprentice under the Prue brothers for 3½ years. He then purchased the property from Mr. Bigham. The property is now part of St. Mary's parking lot. Arthur Frink constructed a snowplow on bobsleds. In the picture are Arthur Frink, Howard Kelsey, Martin Richter, Harold Very, and Enos Pebbles. J. W. Wright had a blacksmith shop on the corner of Washington and Center Streets. G. B. Horth leased the shop in 1902. In 1903, the shop was leased by John Merrick. Warner J. Moore purchased the blacksmith shop in 1907. In more recent years, Roger and Reba Shambo turned the building into their home. The home is now owned by Mr. and Mrs. Peter Lehman. The Corcoran Building was located on the northwest bank of the river next to the bridge. At one time, it was known as the Twining Building. In 1873, the Corcoran brothers, proprietors of a carriage factory, rebuilt their dam, which was carried away in spring waters. The firm employed 8 hands and turned out a large amount of first-class work. The carriage shop behind the main building was the source of a devastating fire that destroyed an entire block of buildings in just 2 hours. The fire having occurred on November 2nd, the village residents had the frame of a 3-story building, including the roof, completed by December 1st for the Corcoran brothers. The brothers, John and James, built a bandwagon that is still in use today. Charles Carpenter and Will Murphy built a gristmill in the Corcoran Building in 1897. The mill had a steel grinder and was powered by steam, naphtha, and gasoline. In 1898, Copenhagen Grange No. 90 purchased the north half of the Corcoran Building. George Kaiser had a barber shop in the building for a short time. Wells Crowner, who drove the stage between Copenhagen and Watertown, purchased a grocery store in the Corcoran Block. He operated the grocery store until 1933, when his son Jerome took over. Jerome ran the store until 1934, when he moved his store to the Oddfellows building. Mr. John Shear remodeled the storefront on the south side of the Corcoran Grange building, where he conducted an undertaking parlor. There were apartments upstairs. Fred and Ann Snyder rented an apartment here at one time. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Ostrander purchased the building in 1957 at public auction. In 1960, the building was torn down and a village park was created. New York State purchased the property in 1960 in conjunction with a bridge reconstruction project. The Brooks House, a 3-in-1 building, was built in 1890 on the site of a building owned by M. Goodenough, which had been destroyed in the fire of 1889. The south end of the building was conducted as a hotel by James Brooks. In 1896, it was reported that Mr. Brooks exchanged his hotel for the home of Fred Butters. In 1898, Mr. Butters sold his hotel to Raymond Ryle. After Mr. Ryle's death, his wife Blanche sold the Ryle house to Mr. Levine, who sold it to Mr. Pate, who then leased it to James Murphy. In 1929, the building was sold to the Dairymen's League. Part of the building, equipped as a grist mill, was sold to W. A. Twining, who conducted a flour and feed business. The center of the building was built by E. R. Austin and W. S. Stiles. There was a grocery on the first floor. The office of Dr. Tamblin was on the second floor. The third floor was a hall. In 1883, the post office was located in this building. In 1888, Mr. Stiles had 200 books ready for lending in his library. The north building was built by John B. Austin and contained H. E. and F. S. Chickering's store. The second floor was used by the Copenhagen Men's Club. The third floor was occupied by the Masonic Lodge until 1915. Joseph Buhal operated a general store here in the early 1900s. Later, Mobart Thomas operated the store. It later became a restaurant operated by Mrs. Pickle, and in the early 1940s by Mr. and Mrs. Pete Demo. Schaefferian Zone of Carthage leased the former Ryle House in 1922 and operated a feed store. Sometime in the 1930s, the entire block was sold to the GLF. The building was then sold to Ontario Retread. It was condemned and torn down in December of 2001. The vacant lot was sold to Ronald and Robert Johnson of Deer River. The lot was purchased by Frank Fazio Jr. in 2002. The building in the rear was also torn down. That building was once a barn for the Ryle House. Later it became the Hoffman-Dudo cheese plant. Mr. Irwin Noyes began his drug business as a partner in the Isdell and Noyes firm, eventually becoming sole proprietor. His drugstore, which stood next to what was to become the Ryle House, was destroyed by the fire of 1889. In 1891, Mr. Noyes constructed a 3-story building on the same site. He reestablished his drug business in his new and elegantly finished store, utilizing the second and third floors for his residence. In 1913, Leon Ryle purchased the building from the estate of E.J. Noyes and opened an ice cream and confectionery store in place of the drugstore. Later, it became Bonner's Ice Cream Parlor. In 1956, the store was sold to Mr. and Mrs. E. L. Brooks, who opened an antique and second-hand store. Mrs. Frank Fazio had the building razed when she purchased it. In 1894, the post office, which had been located in the Noyes Block prior to the fire, was located in this 1-story building on the south side of the Dents Block, now the Town Talk. It remained there for 70 years. When the new post office was built, Vincent Jones bought the property. He rented the property to Steve Rumble, who had a barber shop and a pool hall there. Larry and Carol Doyle bought the property and tore the building down. The new post office was built by Robert D. Farquhar Construction Corporation, Watertown. The building on the corner of Main and Center Streets is on the site of the late Dr. William J. Kramer home, a house built in 1884 by Joseph Empey. In 1899, Munger and Kilburn built a 2-story building on Main Street where they operated a meat market. The Dents Block, as it became known, was located on Main Street between the post office and the J.W. Murphy building. Hiram A. Babcock purchased the property from the heirs of the late Mary E. Dents and operated a barber shop there. The office of the New York Telephone Company was in the rear of the building in 1926. Mr. and Mrs. John Boyce turned the property into a restaurant. Later owners include Mr. and Mrs. John Jamba, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Wheeler, and John and May Gill Crow. About 1962, Mrs. Amelia Doyle McDonald Fazio purchased the property and named it the Town Talk Restaurant. In 1982, Mary Ann Houghton McLean purchased the restaurant. The Town Talk Restaurant was then owned by Lawrence and Carol Doyle. In 2006, Teresa Doyle Trillion purchased the restaurant and continues to operate it today. James S. Mitchell of the firm of Munger and Mitchell built a new store on the corner of Main and River Streets. It was 45 by 25 feet, 2 stories in height, and cost $1,000. In 1880, Mr. C.F. Smith started a flour and feed store in the basement of the Mitchell Block. In 1884, Mr. Frank P. Lansing rented the large double store in the Mitchell Block, formerly occupied by Mr. Millard. Mr. Lansing used the store as a sales room for his furniture business. The building was destroyed by fire in 1889. The lot was sold to W. J. Murphy in 1913, and in 1914, Mr. Murphy replaced the building with a brick one. Herbert Green moved his bakery to the Murphy Block in 1914. He also added an ice cream parlor. Mr. L. D. Sheldon joined Mr. Green in business and purchased Mr. Green's interest in 1924. Robert and Jenny Bowman Jones purchased the building in 1927. The building had 2 storefronts and flats above. The south side of the building was occupied by John Dixon's Grocery. The north side was occupied by Robert and Helen O'Brien Jones Jr.'s general store and later an antique shop. In 1955, the building was sold to Harlan Fairbanks. Richard Chase purchased the building and managed the apartments. The Great Fire of 1889 destroyed 4 business blocks and 4 dwellings. The fire began in the blacksmith and carriage shop in the Corcoran Block near the Main Street Bridge. This 2-story wooden structure contained John Corcoran's grocery, restaurant, and billiard parlor, along with W. O. Munger's meat market. A heavy south wind carried the flames to Fred Green's home next, and from there to the 2-story Stiles Block containing his grocery store and the telephone and telegraph office. The fire continued from there to the house of Mrs. Albert Boynton, which communicated the flames to the 2-story Noyes Block containing his drugstore and the post office. From this block, the fire continued to the Lyman Mitchell home and then to the 2-story block owned by J.S. Mitchell on the corner of Main and River Street. The firemen were able to stop the flames there. The Addison Clark home on the opposite corner caught on fire twice, but firemen were able to save the home. The Copenhagen National Bank was formally opened Thursday, September 14, 1911. The bank was located on the first floor of the Merriman Block on Main Street and was well equipped. Hardwood floors were laid and 2 safes, fire and burglar-proof, were installed. The steel ceiling and sides and large plate glass window made a very attractive appearance. Few towns of its size in northern New York could boast a more complete banking office. The home of Addison Clark, located on the corner of Main and River Streets, was purchased in 1921 to erect a new bank. The Copenhagen National Bank, smallest bank in the United States, merged with the Northern New York Trust Company in 1947. In 1989, Marine Midland Bank's Copenhagen office was sold to Jefferson National Bank. The building was purchased by Carl Jacobs in 1994, and he began Jacobs Pizza Shop, which continues today. In the early days of Copenhagen, Thomas Carroll owned a building known as Bishop House on the site of what today is known as the Davenport property. About 1830, he tore the building down and replaced it. A May 16, 1877 article in the Journal and Republican states, the Davenport brothers, who sometime since purchased the old hotel property on the north side of the river, paying $3,500, are making extensive repairs upon it, having pulled down the old sheds and barns and making things new generally. In October of 1877, the Journal reported that the Hotel Davenport Brothers block, when completed, will present an imposing appearance and will be a credit to the owners and an ornament to the village. It was built of wood 3 stories high, in modern style, with new and commodious barns attached. An 1890 Watertown Herald article states that besides the hotel part, there were 2 large stores attached by a walkway over the driveway. Above the stores was a fine hall capable of seating 400 to 500 people and furnished with a roomy stage and the usual scenery. On the floor above the hall were the Grange and Grand Army halls. On the lower floor of the hotel were a sitting room, office and bar, and a neat and roomy sample room for the use of commercial men, a splendid dining room, and a kitchen that was the neatest of its class. On the floor above was a splendidly furnished parlor and 10 finely arranged guest chambers, some with an ensuite to suit several members of the same family. On the 3rd floor there were 16 more neat chambers, equally as nice as the others. The food at the hotel was described as being well cooked and not excelled in northern New York. The hotel staff was said to have had a quiet way of making a guest feel at home. In 1876 or 77, the Davenport brothers moved Lafayette Hall from behind the Lansing Building and attached it to their hotel. It was then called Davenport Hall. In 1898, the Davenport Hotel property, including 2 stores, the large public hall, and Grand Army of the Revolution Hall, was purchased by Mrs. H.B. Chidester of Alexandria Bay for $7,000. The hotel was operated by the Chidesters until 1904, when they sold it to Charles Clark. After Mr. Clark's death in 1914, his son Robert took over. Robert sold the property to O.D. Waite, who sold part of it to the Copenhagen Lodge of Oddfellows. The advent of Prohibition caused the hotel to be closed in 1919. Among the proprietors in the period between 1919 and 1945 were Robert Jacobs, Mr. Wheeler, Hugh Archer, Del Vroman, Henry Gokey, Hugh Daring, and in 1939, Fred Gill, who had the 3rd story and the overhead connection to the hall removed. In 1950, Francis Sheen of Little Falls purchased the hotel for $30,000 and remodeled the bar and dining room extensively. In 1969, the Davenport was sold to his son, William, and his wife, Edie, who owned the hotel until 1998, when it was sold to Carol and George Harris, William Sheen's daughter and son-in-law. The hotel was quietly closed in 2013. Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Powis purchased the hotel at auction in 2015. They established a tanning salon and offices for 3 C's Auto Sales in the building. Mr. Powis opened the Davenport Bar during the Copenhagen 150th celebration in 2019. Many former patrons descended on the establishment to renew old memories. The charter for Copenhagen Lodge 190, Independent Order of Oddfellows, was issued in 1850. Little of the early history of the lodge can be found, but it is known that William N. Angle, a storekeeper, instigated its formation and was a charter member. At the outbreak of the Civil War, the first contingent from Lewis County included 75 Copenhagen men, and the lodge apparently disbanded at that time. It was reinstated on March 1901 as Copenhagen Lodge 831. In 1906, the lodge purchased its present building, then known as Lafayette Hall, which consisted of 2 stories. Shortly afterward, Will Rich and Sons built the 3rd floor. Originally, the building stood behind the Ryther Block. It was moved about 1877 to its present location, formerly used as the local cattle yards. The building was owned by the Davenport brothers, and the building was connected to the Davenport Hotel by a walkway over the driveway. In 1902, the Casterland Lodge was merged with Copenhagen, and in 1948, the Lowville Lodge joined Copenhagen. The stage and scenery provided for many great presentations by and for the community. Copenhagen High School graduations were held in the Oddfellows Building for some time. The Ecclesiastic Society built a church on the northern corner of Main and Mechanic Streets, across from the Davenport Block, around 1817. The church was used primarily by Methodists and Baptists. In 1832, the building was destroyed by fire. In the late 1800s, the site was known as the Kellogg Block. It was owned by A.H. Kellogg, who, along with G.P. Breen, practiced law there during the 1800s. Franklin B. Cortrell manufactured boots and shoes on the second floor until his death in 1889. Mr. Cortrell was a lifelong resident of Copenhagen and expert maker of boots and shoes. His death marked the passing of this community's boot and shoe manufactory. Mr. Samuel Roberts has moved his family to this village and occupied the living rooms on the second story of the Corcoran Block. Mrs. Roberts conducted a 5 and 10 cent store on the ground floor of the building. This site later became known as the Corcoran Block. The north part was owned by Marlene Burns, a descendant of A.H. Kellogg. Mr. Kellogg purchased the jewelry business of Delancey E. Terrell, located in the corner store of the Corcoran Block in 1901. Mr. Terrell then opened Terrell's Variety Store near Hartleys Market. Charles Colgrove came from Carthage in 1912 to work in Cedric Jacobs's garage, located in the south portion of the building. He bought the building in 1924, remodeled it, and continued his garage business there until his death. August 1970, voters approved the purchase of the Colgrove Block at a cost of $5,500 for use as a village garage in Copenhagen Village Hall. The north part of the building was an apartment building owned by Dorothy Fleming Carter. In August 2007, the village of Copenhagen purchased the north section of the building with plans to have it torn down to make parking space. In the spring of 2008, a garage building was added in the rear of the building on Mechanic Street. As you cross the bridge heading north and take an immediate right, you find an open piece of property owned by Steve Petrus. At one time, 3 businesses were located here. Bob Berry remembers that one of them was a dressmaker's shop. Dutchy Buhal says he believes one of the buildings was Teach Out's meat market. Hartley's Meat Market was first owned by Mr. Edgehill. In 1910, Frank J. Robinson, who was making extensive repairs to the Edgehill property near the park, purchased the property. The building was originally located in front and to the south of the house on the corner of Main and Cataract Streets. It is not known exactly when it was moved to the north side of the house, now its present location. However, Louis Alexander says it was when Cataract Street was straightened and widened. In 1913, the building was damaged by a fire that broke out in the second story, where Kaiser's Barber Shop was located. In 1919, Fred Earl Hartley purchased the meat market and home from Fred J. Robinson after having worked at the market for several years. In July of 1939, Fred Hartley sold his market on Main Street to Arthur Cole of Rodman. Lynn Hartley, Fred's son, would operate the market for Mr. Cole. Sometime between 1939 and 1941, Lynn Hartley purchased the market and made renovations to the second floor. In 1959, Lynn Hartley sold his market to Lawrence Lawley, and it became known as Lawley's Market. In 1974, the building was sold to Mr. and Mrs. Floyd Kempany, who resided on the second floor. They leased the first floor to Kim Sheets. Mr. Sheets operated what he called the Village Pub until 1978. The property was sold to Ken Gaines and Robert Heber in 1992. They opened Ken's Hardware, which they operated until 2006, at which time Richard Ferguson purchased the property. Mr. Ferguson kept the name Ken's Hardware. The store was closed and put on the market for sale in 2016. The house that occupies the lot that borders Main, Washington, and Cataract Streets is one of the first houses built in Copenhagen. It was built by Dr. Samuel Allen and David Canfield. In 1868, John M. Paris moved into the Samuel Allen home. He retained the ancient paneling in the parlor, cut with gouge and chisel by Joseph Bettis. Earl Hartley later purchased the home. The home still stands today. Later owners include Mr. and Mrs. Fred Gill and John and May Gill Crow. Robert and Donna Cooper converted the house into apartments. Mr. and Mrs. Gary Albury purchased the house and did extensive repairs to restore it to its former beauty. It has been vacant for some time. Newell D. Terrell owned a variety store and conducted a prosperous general insurance business. His store was located on the northeast side of Main Street between the J.B. Robinson Hartley Meat Market and W.P. Carpenter hardware store. Deeds show that the property was transferred from Nathaniel Merrill to Etta Terrell and Aileen Schaefery in 1943. In 1945, Aileen transferred ownership of the building to Lynn Hartley. In March of 1946, the property was transferred to Mr. and Mrs. Aloysius Verschneider. In August of 1946, ownership of the building was transferred to John B. and Beatrice Wolschlager, who conducted a grocery store. In 1966, John transferred ownership of the business to his nephew Ralph Wolschlager and his wife Leona. Floyd and Gloria Company took over ownership in 1970. They ultimately had the building torn down. The Carpenter Block was located on the northeast side of Main Street next to what was the Merriman Block and now Gaines Auto. It was a two-building complex connected by a small extension of the Lanphier and Carpenter Building on the left. This building has since been torn down. Harmon E. Kelsey with his son operated the hardware firm of H.E. Kelsey and Son across from the Cottage Inn. Harmon Sr. sold his interest in that firm to his son. Mr. Kelsey purchased the hardware business of the late W.P. Carpenter on Main Street, the building on the right. He continued the business at the old stand, which had been a hardware store for more than 50 years. Having been conducted during that time by Chickering and Hadcock, C. A. Chickering, Victor H. Cook, Carpenter and Fowler, and for 20 years by W.P. Carpenter until his death, and since that time by Mrs. W.P. Carpenter. William E. Fowler, who had been connected with this store for nearly 25 years, purchased the entire assortment of tools and conducted the shop, doing plumbing, roofing, tinning, repairing, etc. The Carpenter and Fowler building still remains today as the Amish Connection. The Merriman Block was a three-story building located where Kevin Gaines's service station is today. The upper floors were apartments, while the lower floor was home to a wide variety of renters. Some merchants who set up their business in the Merriman Block in the 1800s included a tailoring shop, Dr. Tamblin's office, E.W. Farmer's dentist's office, Copenhagen YMCA, Horace Rich ice cream parlor and bakery, and a dressmaking shop. Businesses in the 1900s included E. E. Harrington Photography Studio, H. E. Hubertus Clothing Store, and a museum. In 1907, Mrs. Mary Merriman sold the building to Hiram Lanphier. During this time, Susan Parker opened a bakery in the Merriman Block. Rooms were remodeled for the opening of the Copenhagen National Bank. A 10-pennant bowling alley was established, and rooms were remodeled in preparation for a moving picture theater. In 1927, Fred Wadsworth purchased the building from Mrs. Carrie Scoville. During Mr. Wadsworth's ownership, Mr. Fred Miles operated a restaurant there. Ernest Clock opened a meat market in a space previously occupied by Walter Jones. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Jacobs operated a restaurant in the block. In 1937, fire destroyed the block. The roof and third floor were completely destroyed. The fire started in the rear of the red and white store on the first floor, where Myron Weir, proprietor, was heating lard. The fire spread rapidly through the partitions and spread out and up on the third floor and roof. The red and white store, market basket, and a restaurant owned and operated by Peter Demo were badly damaged by fire, smoke, and water. In 1937, A.R. Baldrick of Watertown purchased the Wadsworth Block and tore down the damaged building. In 1940, Mr. Willard Zare began to operate a gas station on the site for the Atlantic Refining Company. In 1942, John Boyle ran the Atlantic Gas and Oil Company, leased from the Atlantic Refining Company, and purchased the station in 1955. The storage tanks for Robert Vogt's fuel oil business were located on the premises. His office was located down the street in the building presently owned by Jeff Powis. In 1964, after working for Mr. Boyle for 14 years, Leonard Vogt purchased the business and operated it until 1991. Kenny Gaines operated a farm tractor repair shop on the site for a short time. Today, the property is owned by Kevin Gaines, who operates a garage. The Merrill Wagon and Harness Shop was located between the Merriman Block and Dr. Kramer's house on the east side of Main Street. Lester Smith later operated a harness and shoe repair shop there. At one time, the A&P Grocery and then the Grand Union grocery stores were located in the south side of the block. In later years, Bernard Carter operated an appliance store there with an apartment above. The north side of the block was a drugstore at one time. It later was a soda bar owned by Clarence McLean. There was an apartment above this section also. The MP Building, as it was known, was destroyed by fire October 12, 1959. In 1961, Bernard Carter built the present building on the site. His wife, Dorothy Fleming, operated the store known as the Boutique. The building is currently owned by Gary Alberry. Dr. Kramer was a physician in the village of Copenhagen for 45 years. He was graduated from New York Medical University in 1882 and came to Copenhagen soon thereafter. His home and office were located on the corner of Main and Center Streets, where the post office is today. He passed away in 1930. The Frank P. Lansing Building was located on the east side of Main Street on the corner of Main and Center Streets. The building at one time housed the business of Engel and Raymond and then the furniture and undertaking business of J.W. Empey. In 1884, Mr. F. P. Lansing had purchased the stock of Mr. Empey's furniture and undertaking business. He moved his furniture stock into the J.S. Mitchell Block on the corner of Main and River Street, now the Murphy Block. The location was described as the finest store in town. In 1902, a fire broke out on the second floor of the business. The cause thought to be spontaneous combustion. The building was gutted. The office of the Black River Telephone Company, located in the building, was also damaged. In 1917, Mr. Lansing sold the business to Charles Ryther. Mr. Ryther conducted a furniture store on the first floor, a funeral parlor on the second floor, and maintained his residence on the third floor, going out of business in 1956. In 1956, Mr. Ryther sold his block to Mr. Floyd Taylor. Mr. Taylor conducted a farm machinery shop at this location from 1956 to 1959. Later, Peter Pan Studios operated a photography studio here. In 1976, the block was torn down. Bill Sheen purchased the property. Mr. Jeff Powis owns the vacant lot today. He has used the lot to display cars from his 3 C's auto business. Next to the Ryther Building was Cedric Jacobs's garage and gas station. Cedric was the local Ford dealer. In 1934, Wilfred Horning moved to Copenhagen and operated W.H. Horning & Sons farm machinery store here. Walter Cooper stands in front of the Horning garage and Ryther's funeral business. Harry Van Dressen rented the garage. He sold Chevy cars from his home on Mechanic Street. The Philadelphia Milk Company leased the Harry Van Dressen garage on Main Street in 1936 and shipped fluid milk from there. In 1940, the Philadelphia Producers Company moved their milk plant operation on Main Street to the plant formerly owned by Brown and Bailey Condensery on Maple Avenue. Later tenants of the building were Tom and Lil Swerdowski, who operated a laundromat, Bob Voigt's fuel business offices, Bill Sheen's apartments, and the present owner, Jeff Powis's apartments. The space on the corner of Main and Maiden Lane, now occupied by Stewart's, was at one time a house and a service station. The home was owned by Congressman Charles Chickering. People say it was a beautiful house with a marble fireplace. Mr. and Mrs. Ledette Millard became owners of the property and later sold it to the Empire Petroleum Corporation of Watertown. It later became the Northern New York service station operated by Charles Jones. In 1938, James LeClaire was the owner of the service station. In 1969, the service station was operated by Niles Scoville. In 1986, the property was a convenient food mart. In 1994, Stewart Shops purchased the property, which at the time was a Bonfair food store. In 1904, Cook and Otis owned the Copenhagen cheese factory on the site of what was later Queen's Farms Dairy. Mr. Grant purchased the property in 1905 and erected a large modern creamery and cheese factory. The factory was equipped with all the modern appliances to produce butter and cheese. In 1912, Mr. Grant sold the plant to the Brown and Bailey Condensed Milk Company. New machinery was installed and the factory refitted to produce condensed milk. The plant was operated until 1937, making condensed milk and ice cream mix, most of which was trucked to Deer River and sent to New York City on railroad cars. At one time, 950 tons of ice were stored in the factory ice house. Ren Horan was the last manager for Brown and Bailey. The Philadelphia Milk Producers Cooperative Association, Incorporated, had a milk plant in the Harry Van Dressen garage on Main Street where they shipped milk. In 1940, the business was moved to the formerly owned Brown and Bailey Condensery on Maple Avenue, which had been closed since 1937. The Philadelphia Company purchased the property and entirely remodeled and equipped it into an up-to-date creamery, which shipped from 500 to 700 cans of fluid milk daily to New York City. Later, the plant was reopened by Lynn Maynard, who also operated for 2 or more years a milk plant in the building that last had been occupied by John Augustine. The Maynard Milk Company was succeeded by Queen's Farms. Eddie Gibson was the first manager of Queen's Farms. He was followed by Melvin Bucher, and on May 15, 1948, by Arthur Stewart. The plant started making cheese in February 1950, construction of the cheese factory having been commenced in June 1949. From February to July of each year, about 25 persons were employed at the plant, which had about 7 full-time employees. The first church building to be erected in what was then Munger's Mills was on the northeast corner of Main and Mechanic Streets, where the village hall is today. It had been erected principally by Presbyterians and Baptists. In 1832, fire destroyed the church. By then, a number of Methodists had settled here, and after the Presbyterian church burned, the Methodists and the Presbyterians united and built a building known as Temperance Temple on the site of the present United Church of Copenhagen. This building was used for divine worship for 53 years until it was torn down and the present Congregational Church was erected in 1886. The first mention of the change from Presbyterian Church to Congregational Church was made in 1839 and legally organized May 21, 1841, under the name the First Congregational Church. The church was wired for lights in 1910. The kitchen and dining room were remodeled in 1926. The church celebrated its 150th anniversary, October 1955. In 1960, there were combined parishes and alternate services between the Congregational and Methodist churches. In May 1967, the congregations of the Copenhagen United Church of Christ and the First Methodist Church voted to work under a federation agreement and used the name the United Church of Copenhagen. In 1833, after the church on the corner of Main and Mechanic Streets burned, the Baptist Society erected a new building on Center Street. The church building underwent extensive renovations and was rededicated in 1876. In 1913, the Copenhagen Masonic Lodge purchased the building and made the necessary adjustments to make it fit for their meeting place. The dedication of the Masonic Temple took place in January of 1914. The building sat unused for a period of time. It has since been purchased by Lester Buyer. Grace Episcopal Church on Cataract Street in Copenhagen was built and incorporated in 1877. The ground for the church was donated by Mrs. Nathaniel Sylvester, a church member. The priest in charge in the early days of the church came from Grace Episcopal Church, Carthage, and it is thought that the Copenhagen church was given the same name for that reason. Women of the church financed the building of a guild house in 1889 at a cost of $500. St. Cecilia's Guild installed a kitchen at the turn of the century, and carpeting was laid in the church also about that time. Higley Hall, an annex to the church, was built in 1968. The interior of the church was redecorated in 1972. The church celebrated its 125th anniversary in 2002. The Methodists joined with the Presbyterians in building a house of worship on a site later occupied by the Congregational Church. Both denominations used that edifice until the construction of a Methodist church in 1842 on a lot on Main Street purchased from Philip Shaw. The remainder of the church lot was bought in 1851 and sheds were built. The church itself consisted of a plain room, a bare floor, seats which faced two doors opening directly onto the street. A bench pulpit was located between the doors. There was an altar in front of the pulpit with an old-fashioned leaf table and two chairs. Box stoves stood on either side of the doors, and there were 6 large, many-lighted windows, 3 on each side. In 1865, the church was repaired and remodeled. In 1960, the Methodist Church was united with the Congregational Church. The combined parishes alternated service providers between the Congregational and Methodist churches. During the 1963-64 school year, the Methodist Church was housing 75 students in 3 sections of first grade. The church building was eventually torn down, and Snowbelt Housing built a 2-home complex, which remains today. Harrisburg had the first Catholic church in this section. Built in 1869, St. Mary's Church was located on the Wood Battle Road. The present St. Mary's Church on High Street in Copenhagen was built in 1901. The land was purchased from Mrs. Robert Conklin. Land on the south side of the church was purchased from Allie Ward. The lot on the north side, where the rectory now stands, was purchased by Reverend Father McLaughlin, who willed it to his sister, who later donated the lot to the church. James Carey, a parishioner, built the church and constructed both its side altars and the main altar. Ground was broken for a new rectory in 1927. The house and its furnishings are jointly owned by St. Mary's and Saints Peter and Paul churches. Necessitated by the parish's expansion, St. Mary's was rebuilt and enlarged in 1931. Among the improvements were new hardwood floors in the sanctuary, transcript, and sacristy, a new basement and parlor, and a new heating unit. In 1937, the church was partially destroyed by fire. Repairs were completed in May 1938, and the church was rededicated. Improvements included a new side altar and a Gothic confessional built by Jerome J. Brainerd to replace the altar and confessional destroyed by the fire. St. Mary's Cemetery was incorporated in 1909. The church's annual turkey dinner remains a huge community event. The dinner concept was begun around 1945 and continues today, serving around 800 meals on the night of the dinner. The River of Life Fellowship Church had its beginning in a Bible study being held at the home of Ted and Mary Mysick around 1983. Dave Larkin, pastor of Faith Fellowship in Watertown, suggested forming a church in this area. In 1987, the group rented the Grace Church Hall for their services. The first church building was built on the Doran Road just outside the village around 1993. Property was purchased on the corner of the number 3 road and Route 12. A new building was erected in 2013. An addition was completed in 2019. Certificate of Incorporation of the Carthage and Copenhagen Railroad was issued in April of 1906. By September, the first grading over the 8-mile line was complete and the first shipment of rails had arrived. The first engine the Carthage and Copenhagen Railroad owned was a used one purchased from the Mecca Lumber Company and arrived for service on October 7, 1906. In May 1907, a coach was purchased. The formal opening of the Carthage and Copenhagen Railroad took place in June of 1907 with much celebration. An old barn on the James Brown property was used as the railroad station and freight house. The women of the community raised money to build a suitable station. There was much talk of extending the railway to connect the Lehigh Valley Railroad in Camden. Surveys were done, but no action was ever taken. In 1917, the railroad started to falter financially and was sold under mortgage foreclosure. A charter was granted to the Deer River Railroad Corporation to operate the former Carthage and Copenhagen line. That company dissolved in 1918, and the railroad was abandoned. With World War I then being fought, the United States government took over the railroad, and the tracks were torn up and sent to France. The railroad right-of-way was sold to Charles Pratt in the fall of 1919 to provide a means of transmitting electric power from High Falls to the sulfite mill of the Island Paper Company in Carthage. The station house the women raised money to build was given back to them in 1923. It was the intention to move the building to a strip of land facing Main Street and to be used as a public library. It actually was used as a garage for the village truck. The railroad property was eventually purchased by Louis Alexander. He sold it to the Copenhagen Volunteer Fire Department. The Copenhagen Band was formed March 31, 1848. George Hazen was first to be chosen as band leader. John H. Raymond later was the leader from 1858 to his death in 1913. The cornet band consisted of 16 pieces. The huge bass drum thumped the rhythm for many years. The thick head bears the inscription Raymond's Band NL of M, number 89, Copenhagen. In 1936, the band began its 93rd year of performing on the Village Park Triangle. The band ceased functioning in 1940 when C.L. Ryle was bandmaster. In 1871, the Corcoran brothers built a new bandwagon in their shop in Copenhagen at a cost of $500. It was beautifully painted by Mr. J.C. Wolfe. The wagon was rehabilitated in 1935. The bandwagon was put on display at the Cooperstown Farmers Museum in 1948. It was again refurbished in 1989 and returned to Copenhagen. The bandwagon has been a showpiece in many parades in Copenhagen, never more so than the 150th anniversary celebration. It was then that Mr. Eric Topman, musician and antique instrument collector of Stockton, California, put together a reenactment complete with the original drum he owned and the Syracuse-based Excelsior Cornet Band. The drum was once again returned to Copenhagen after the celebration. Fire apparatus was first mentioned in village board minutes in May of 1873. The board voted to buy 2 hose, chains and rope, 50 water pails, and 2 ladders. The department was formally organized in June of 1889. 2 chemical engines were purchased. In 1890, voters approved the purchase of property owned by Duane Paris on Mechanic Street for a lockup and engine house. The rooms in the Merriman Block were used for meetings. In 1893, the department purchased a hand engine. A hook and ladder truck was purchased in 1901. The first motorized fire truck was purchased in 1932. In 1951, the Copenhagen Fire Department was incorporated. The department was renamed the Copenhagen Volunteer Fire Department. In June of 1977, members voted to proceed with plans to have Lundy Corporation erect a metal building on Main Street. The property was purchased from Louis Alexander. Ground was broken in the fall of 1977, and the floor and shell were completed by the end of the year. Trucks and equipment were moved into the new facility the last week of 1978. A racing team was organized in 1934 on Labor Day at the Carthage Field Day, when the department participated in 2-foot races. The firemen at that time had no squad car. In 1935, the village board agreed to give the fire department squad team $75 for racing suits, provided the department bought the team a squad car. In January 1936, the fire company purchased a car, which was completely rebuilt under the direction of Martin Richter in late summer of 1937. The squad entered their first competition with the car in August 1937. The village of Copenhagen furnished orange and black uniforms for the squad team to match the colors of the squad car. The squad won Northern New York championships in 1972, 73, 74, and 75. The race team represented the village well, as noted by the number of trophies on display in the meeting room today. The Firemen's Auxiliary was organized in December 1946 with 14 members. Mr. Stephen R. Cleveland of the Deer River Power Company bought the rights at High Falls from George J. Dryden and others, and afterward secured a franchise to operate in the village of Copenhagen. Engineers estimated that 25,000 horsepower could be developed there. The land purchase, made in 1908 from Henry L. Roberts on the east side of the river, includes a strip of land along the brink of the river 1 rod wide and extends from the line between the Roberts and Davenport farms far enough to include the fall and takes to the center of the stream. In 1909, Stephen R. Cleveland, Lou B. Cleveland, and Senator George H. Cobb incorporated the Deer River Power Company with the Secretary of State. The construction of the power plant at High Falls near Copenhagen for the Deer River Power Company was being pushed to rapid completion in September 1909. The immense dam was finished. The spillway of the dam is 100 feet long, but the whole length of the dam is nearly 200 feet. It is 30 feet high from the riverbed. The blasting was begun for the house, which was to be located 1,200 feet down the river. The feeder pipe, which was to carry the water from the dam to the wheel pit at the powerhouse, was being carried along the top of the riverbank, just above the powerhouse, where it goes down the bank to the wheels. This penstock, where the pressure was least, is made of Georgia pine and is a 4-foot pipe, but where the pressure is to be greatest, the wooden conduit will be substituted by iron, the size of which will be reduced to 10 or 12-inch pipe, and 100-foot pressure will be generated. Lewis Cleveland of Watertown is employed as engineer of the job. Within 6 months from starting the development, the work had been completed. By December 22, 1909, electric power generated at the new power plant of the Deer River Power Company at High Falls was furnishing light for the streets of this village and would be continued in service. At a meeting of the town board held in 1910, a franchise was granted to the Deer River Power Company of this place to set poles and string wire upon any highway in the town of Denmark. The powerhouse was enlarged in 1913 to double the horsepower produced. On July 1, 1919, Mr. Pratt of the Island Paper Company of Carthage took possession of the Deer River Power Company. Workmen of the Deer River Power Company in 1949 worked on construction of a new central portion of the flight of steps leading to the power plant below High Falls. The stairs in the complete flight numbered 253 steps, about one-third of which were replaced. In 1950, the Deer River Power Company was in the possession of Niagara Mohawk. Perkins Academy was located on the northern border of the village of Copenhagen on Washington Street. It had been opened as a private school in the fall of 1879 by Reverend Judson O. Perkins in a building erected by William Canfield in 1861. The academy was closed in 1885. The property, consisting of 11 acres, was sold to Mr. A. G. Thompson in 1889. Mr. Charles Neidle owned the Perkins Academy building in 1931 when it was struck by lightning. The large three-storied building was destroyed by the ensuing fire. Later owners of the property include John Wolfschlager, Joseph Hebert, and Eric and Mary Shambo. The first school to become known as the District School was located on Mechanic Street. It consisted of 2 rooms, one for intermediate and one for primary. After remodeling, the Copenhagen Union Free School had 4 rooms. A library was installed by the Board of Regents, and a recitation and training classroom were added later. Fred A. Walker was the first principal in 1887. In 1892, Regents exams were given in the school for the first time. Students in prior years had to go to Carthage for the exams. In 1897, the school became Copenhagen High School. The first class to have a commencement was that of 1904, when there were 8 graduates. Vaccinations were given in the school for the first time in 1907. 19 non-residents from Harrisburg, Pinckney, Casterland, Barnes Corners, Montague, Rutland, and Deer River were in attendance at the Copenhagen School in 1907, paying tuition at the rate of $5 per term for the academic department, $4 per term for the intermediate, and $3 per term for the primary. In 1909, Charlevoix brothers were given a contract to build a new red brick building for $16,000. The new red brick building was occupied in 1910, a fine and modern high school, a source of pride to the citizens and students of the village. It housed all the grades and high school. The building was equipped with a fine library and had all the modern conveniences. The students were fine examples of America's young generation and were heartily supported by the citizens in their schoolwork. In 1911, report cards were introduced for the first time. Class honors were recorded for the first time in 1915. Valedictorian was Mary Buhall of Copenhagen, and Ray Burdick of Lowville was salutatorian. 1917 saw the state education department give school credit to students who worked on farms. Physical training became a part of the curriculum. The school had a Red Cross nurse for the first time this year. The passing grade for examinations was set at 70. Fire drills were required for the first time in 1925. In 1926, 2 3/4 acres of land owned by William H. Landon in the rear of and adjoining the Copenhagen High School property was purchased for the purpose of making it into a community playground with a baseball field, tennis court, and football field. The money necessary for the purchase was raised by popular subscription, and the land was deeded to the Copenhagen High School. Talk of centralization began in 1930. The Alumni Association was formally organized in 1932, with a banquet held at the Masonic Temple. The school system was centralized December 6, 1934. The Copenhagen Central School District was organized in 1936. The red brick building was torn down and replaced with a new Central School building, which was dedicated in 1936. Gerald B. Newton served as principal from 1937 to 1946. During his 9-year tenure, the new Central School building was completed, dedicated, and occupied. New departments of health, physical education, art, music, homemaking, agriculture, library, and dental hygiene were instituted. Under Mr. Newton's administration, some 25 former common school districts in an area of more than 100 square miles were consolidated into the Copenhagen Central School District. Enrollment increased from 200 to more than 400 students. The faculty increased from 9 teachers to 26 teachers. All students received free textbooks. Cafeteria service was begun. 11 bus routes were established. Copenhagen Central became a training center for cadets from Potsdam State, Oswego State, and Syracuse University. On December 12, 1953, voters of Central District No. 1, towns of Denmark, Harrisburg, Pinckney, and Champion, approved a $320,000 expansion. The expansion included a 10-stall garage and a 2-story L on the southwest side of the building. This L wing included 6 elementary classrooms, a playroom, cafeteria, and kitchen. Also included in the proposition were monies to grade the athletic field. The proposition included conversion of the former garage into a shop, agriculture room, storeroom for gym and shop equipment, and an office for the physical education director. The proposition allowed for the converting of the old cafeteria to a music room, the old kitchen to an art room, and the old shop to a kindergarten room. The remodeling proposition voted on in 1953 was completed in 1955. The school was said to have comfortable capacity for 600 students. By 1963, more space was needed. The State Department refused to give permission for a proposed 8-room addition unless Copenhagen agreed to a merger with Carthage. The Copenhagen Board steadfastly opposed the merger. Instead, the board decided to lease the Methodist Church, then in its 121st year, for 2 years. In 1966, Copenhagen students were able to attend the Lewis County BOCES Vocational School for the first time. In the same year, the state agreed to allow a $500,000 building proposition to go before voters. The proposition included an 8-room elementary addition, a bus service garage, and the acquisition of 10 acres of land. Enrollment had increased to 788 students by 1968. The increase in enrollment required a staff of 1 principal, 57 teachers, 5 teacher aides, a guidance counselor, 3 office employees, 6 cafeteria workers, 4 custodians, and 12 bus drivers. The 1966 building project was completed in 1968. The Copenhagen District enrollment reached 850 students in 1970-71. The blizzard of '77 extensively damaged the gymnasium roof. In September 1977, preliminary plans for the proposed alterations to the Copenhagen Central School Building and gymnasium facilities were made. The class of 1980 was the first class to graduate in the new gym. In 2000, a building project included 2 kindergarten rooms, 6 classrooms, a choral and band room, new bathrooms, addition to the library, and a second gymnasium. The project created a courtyard as the rooms added, joined around it. The Riverside Cemetery is located on Cataract Street in the village of Copenhagen. Land for the cemetery was donated by Nathan Munger, Jr. A logging bee was called to clear the land. All the men in the community came out to help. Many of the early settlers are buried here. In 1867, a meeting of the citizens of Copenhagen and vicinity was held to discuss improving and fencing the cemetery, building a vault, and enlarging the grounds. At this meeting, a resolution was passed to form an association to be known by the name of Riverside Cemetery Association at Copenhagen. In 1868, the town of Denmark deeded the cemetery land to the trustees of the Riverside Cemetery Association and their successors. In 1909, the Riverside Cemetery Association purchased about 1 acre of land on the southwest side of the cemetery. Old records were lost when the Wadsworth block was torn down. Existing records date from 1913. A new vault was built in 1914 and is still in use today. In 1998, the association purchased 29 acres of land between Cataract and Stoddard Streets for $5,000. 2 New York State grants have been obtained to secure monuments that pose a topple hazard. T.F. Wright and Son Granite Foundry has done the work. In 2017, members of the River of Life Fellowship Church raked the entire cemetery. They have made this an annual outreach to the community ever since. It came to the board's attention that there were bodies buried in unmarked graves in the rear of the cemetery. In 2017, a monument was erected to honor those interred there. Grace Episcopal Church and T.F. Wright and Sons Granite Foundry helped financially with this project. A new shed was purchased in 2017 and placed in the annex to house lawn equipment and to become compliant with cemetery vault regulations. Copenhagen Medical Center was a project of the Civics Club. Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Clock donated 1/2 acre of land on Route 12 across from the Wood Battle Road. Ground was broken in October of 1968. A formal dedication was held January 30th, 1972. Many businesses, organizations, and local citizens pledged financial assistance and manpower to build the center. 1969 marked the 100th anniversary of the incorporation of the village of Copenhagen. In celebration, people dressed in period apparel. Various events were planned. Miss Anne Boyle was crowned Miss Copenhagen and would preside over the festivities. A long table was set up to serve refreshments. Antiques and memorabilia were displayed in various locations throughout the village, remembering the village's past. Dinners were served by various churches. The PTO presented the Lemmer and Fome musical Camelot. The bandwagon was brought back from the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown for the parade. 2019 marked the 150th anniversary of the incorporation of the village of Copenhagen. The village clerk, Sue Parker, suggested having a village-wide celebration. The committee was formed and they put together a celebration for the record books. The celebration began at the village park with the flag raising and the invocation. Awards were given for the design of the T-shirt logo. Events included games and bounce houses that were well attended. There was a petting zoo and pony rides, a watermelon eating contest for kids and adults. The streets were lined with vendors of all kinds, including food trucks and a wood carver. Antique cars were on display. The 10th Mountain Division Band entertained at the bandstand. The Dairy Princess, Kelsey Beyer, and Dairy Ambassador, Stephanie Beyer, were on hand at the ice cream social at Frank and Jill LaBarge's Old Mill ice cream stand. A major highlight of the celebration was led by Eric Totman from Stockton, California. Mr. Totman, a musician and collector of antique musical instruments, in conjunction with Jeff Stockham's Excelsior Cornet Band from Syracuse, put together a reenactment of the J.H. Raymond Band. The Raymond Band was thought to be the first small community band in New York. Totman brought to the reenactment the original bass drum played by John Mitchell in the original J.H. Raymond Band. The band stopped by the gravesite of Mr. Raymond and played for him. A large parade was highlighted by the band playing music from the bandwagon being driven by Randy Nickel. The parade was followed by a glorious display of fireworks.